My name is Nicole MartinRogers. I live in Minnesota in the US, and I'm from here, lived here my whole life. I am a descendant of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, which is a tribe that's located in northern Minnesota. My dad's an enrolled member of the tribe, grew up on the reservation, and moved to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul when he was an adult. And that's where I live and have lived here my whole life. And I work for Wilder Research, which is a nonprofit organization that does program evaluation and applied research. So we're part of an operating foundation that provides direct services in the community. And Wilder Research does the evaluation of all of the, or many of the services and programs that Wilder Foundation runs. And then we also do a lot of other evaluations for nonprofit organizations and foundations and state agencies and tribes, mostly in the state of Minnesota, although we do some work outside of the state. So. I mean, to some degree, I think that we would try to make sure that whatever the approach is tailored to that community's needs and also their preferences. And so there's not like one standard approach, I would say, that we would use when working with communities, other than the part about that you have to have some kind of a relationship and mutual understanding about what the goal of the project is and who's deciding about it and who owns it when it's done. And that's super important to do with American Indian communities, regardless of what the project is, to just get that out on the table to begin with, so everybody understands if this foundation is paying for it and they think that they own it, then the tribe and the people who are participating should know that from the beginning, so they can then decide if they want to participate or not. So I think that's an approach to use, is just relationship building and clarifying the purpose, scope, ownership of the project from the beginning. And then from there, you know, the methods can really be tailored. A lot of times I use standard program evaluation and social science methods with tribes. I mean, occasionally we'll modify a method or a tool. We'll do a talking circle instead of a focus group or things like that. But a lot of times the methods are pretty similar once you actually get into the research. So I think that research is a real trigger word for a lot of American Indian people because of stuff that I mentioned a little earlier about people just sort of have had the experience. I mean, they're rightfully triggered by it because they've had this repeated experience of people coming in and doing research on them and then publishing it for their own benefit or going back and checking the box so they can get their funding or whatever it is, and nothing ever changes for the people that participated in the research. And so I think there's a lot of initial skepticism and mistrust, rightfully, about when people hear the word research, about what is this. I think that can be gotten past when you, if you have some existing trust, or you can establish trust through communication and just showing up repeatedly, you know, at things that, persistence and things like that. There's one other thing I was going to say. Oh, I also think that, I mean, many of the Native American people that I work with that are like leaders of nonprofit organizations or work in government, you know, they are accustomed to the evaluation and research game. And so I think that they're more open to the idea. Like, they're not skeptical when they hear they have to do an evaluation. They understand that's part of the funding, but it's more of like a box for them to check or some extra thing that they don't see how it's necessarily going to be useful for them. So they just want to get it done and have it do as little harm as possible to their project in the process. But I don't think that they necessarily see that as a something that they could use to help improve the work that they're doing. That's an unlikely scenario. I think more common is just like, let me just get this thing done that my funder is requiring me to do. It sometimes is state agencies through different funding streams or grant programs. And we also have a pretty robust set of foundations, philanthropic organizations in Minnesota that fund a lot of the work that we end up doing with the tribes. So they'll fund a program, or one of the foundations that we work with, the Bush Foundation, has funded a lot of work related to tribal governance stuff, and their service areas, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. So we've done quite a bit of stuff with them and helping tribes do things like project out what their population is going to be if they reform their constitution and reform or revise their membership criteria. So a lot of the tribes in the states use blood quantum to determine who can be a member or not. And that's part of the tribal constitution. And so if they decide they want to revise that, they have to go through this big process. And we've helped a couple tribes with different parts of that process and things like that. A very many number of American Indian organizations that serve the Twin Cities area that are specifically set up to serve the American Indian community in the urban area. So for example, there's like the Minneapolis American Indian Center, or the American Indian Family Center in St. Paul. There's the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. All the tribes have urban offices that they have in, so even though the Minneapolis and St. Paul area isn't shared geography with any of the tribes, we have many of our tribal members live in the Twin Cities. So all the tribes have urban offices here, and they serve their tribal members out of their urban offices. We also have a large public housing complex called Little Earth right in Minneapolis. That's the only public housing complex in the US that's dedicated or gives preference to American Indian people. So it's sort of like a little mini reservation, but it's intertribal in the city. So yeah, there's a large number of mostly nonprofit, or I guess you probably call them non-governmental organizations that serve that community here. Yep. I mean, they all have different things that are going on. Right now, we have this huge crisis in Minneapolis because there's this homeless encampment that started like at the beginning of the summer, and there's been anywhere from like 100 to 300 people camping at this encampment right in the city of Minneapolis. I mean, it's right in between like this highway and this major intersection, and people have just set up hundreds of tents along this thing, and now they have a teepee there, and they have all these different, it's like gotten to be a pretty big community, but it's problematic, obviously, because people can't. I mean, now it's winter here, and it's like 20 degrees. It's cold. We've got snow on the ground, and so a lot of the organizations have been rallying around this encampment and trying to figure out what we're going to do with the people that are staying at the encampment. And one of the tribes from northern Minnesota has offered up some of their land that they have that's in Minneapolis right by the encampment, and then they're going to build this winterized shelter and stuff. And so like the tribes and the nonprofit organizations and the city of Minneapolis are all working together to try to solve the issue. So I would say that's a big like current thing that's going on with homelessness. But then we've also got, there's organizations that do healthy eating. There's organizations that do cultural preservation type of activities, like providing language tables, Indigenous language tables, or drum and dance activities for kids and families to get involved in, and traditional games and like winter storytelling activities and stuff. So there's cultural preservation, there's health stuff, and then there's all the stuff related to social problems. We've got programs for addiction for moms who are addicted, housing programs for people in recovery and things like that. So. In general, there's probably not a whole lot of evaluation that goes on systematically, but some of the programs have funding like from this statewide health improvement program grant or things like that. And so they have to do evaluation. So there's certainly, some examples of specific programs that get evaluated because their funder tells them that they have to. And then we did an evaluation for this organization called Tiwahi Foundation, and they run a grant program called the American Indian Family Empowerment Program grant, and they give small grants to American Indian individuals who live in the Twin Cities. and they have 3 focus areas: education, economic self-sufficiency, and cultural preservation. And they just give people like $2,000 to buy supplies to make powwow regalia, or they'll give them, you know, $1,500 to buy a computer to get finish school and stuff. And so we did an evaluation of that program that was, I would say, probably a little bit more culturally responsive than a lot of the state-funded evaluations that we have to do, because this organization just wanted to do it and they initiated it so they could kind of tell us what the scope was and what their questions were and things like that. And so that was a cool program to evaluate, because it's more of a culturally based model too of how to support a community member in achieving their own goals and becoming a more productive contributing member of the community. And so I really liked doing that evaluation. I think that was an example where they've now been using that to kind of tell the story of the program to different stakeholders, because it's framed up in a way that like local funders, it's appealing to them and stuff, because it uses some of that evaluative language. So there are examples, you know, isolated examples, I would say, of where evaluation has really been used really effectively. And then more widespread is like, we just have to do this evaluation because our funder tells us to do it. And then it oftentimes will align with, you know, that a state might fund American Indian organizations and Somali organizations and Hmong organizations, and they're all trying to address health disparities in their own community, but then the state has some overarching evaluation framework that they want to apply to all of those communities, so that's a little different.